November 8, 1942. The Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of northwest Africa. Sergeant Harry Butcher sat in the radio room of the Allied Forces headquarters in Gibraltar and watched the reports coming in from 3 simultaneous amphibious landings on the northwestern coast of Africa: Casablanca in Morocco, Oran in Algeria, and Algiers in Algeria, and tried to determine whether what was happening was a military operation or a political disaster. The first major amphibious operation conducted by American forces in the Second World War, the largest amphibious landing in American history to that point, the operation that was supposed to demonstrate to the British skeptics who questioned American military capability that the United States Army could fight, was being opposed. Not by the Germans. By the French. The French forces defending the North African territories of Morocco and Algeria were forces of the Vichy French government, the government that had signed an armistice with Germany in June 1940 and that had been governing the unoccupied portion of France and its overseas territories since. The soldiers who were manning the coastal guns at Casablanca, who were flying aircraft against the American paratroopers landing near Oran, who were fighting American soldiers in the streets of Algiers, were French soldiers who had survived the fall of France and who now found themselves in the specific moral complexity of being asked to fight the Americans who had come to liberate them from German domination. Some of them thought they were. Others thought they were defending French sovereignty from an Anglo-American invasion. Others had not made their moral assessment and were simply following the orders that the chain of command had given them. The political dimension of the North Africa landings was as complex as any military operation the United States conducted in the entire war, and it produced the specific combination of military and political confusion that occurs when military force and diplomacy are applied simultaneously to the same problem without adequate coordination between the two. To understand what was happening in Northwest Africa on November 8, 1942, you have to understand the specific political situation that the Allied planners had been trying to navigate since the North Africa operation was first proposed. The proposal to land in Northwest Africa had been controversial from its inception. The American military planning establishment, led by Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, had wanted to land in France in 1942, arguing that the quickest path to defeating Germany was the most direct one, across the English Channel and into France itself. The British, who had been fighting the war since 1939 and who understood the state of American military readiness in 1942 rather better than the Americans themselves, had argued that a cross-channel attack in 1942 would be a disaster. North Africa was the British compromise, and it was the compromise that Winston Churchill had been pressing since early in the Anglo-American military discussions of 1942. Landing in Northwest Africa would establish an Allied presence on the southern shore of the Mediterranean, would threaten the German and Italian forces fighting in Libya and Egypt, and would give American forces the combat experience and the operational learning that the British believed was necessary before a cross-channel attack could succeed. Roosevelt had accepted the compromise over Marshall's objections, and Operation Torch had been planned under the command of General Dwight Eisenhower, who had arrived in London in June 1942 and who had been managing the specific political and military complexities of the North Africa operation ever since. The political complexity centered on the French. The French Empire in North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia contained approximately 120,000 French soldiers who were equipped, at varying levels, and who owed their formal allegiance to the Vichy government that controlled them. If those 120,000 soldiers resisted the Allied landing, the cost in American lives would be severe and the delay in establishing the North African bridgehead would give the Germans time to respond. If those soldiers did not resist, or if they could be persuaded to change sides immediately, the entire strategic situation in the Mediterranean would change within hours. The Allied plan for managing this political dimension was a series of secret negotiations conducted in the weeks before the landing with French military and political figures who were believed to be sympathetic to the Allied cause. General Mark Clark had been landed by submarine on the Algerian coast in October 1942 for a secret meeting with French officials that was itself one of the more dramatic episodes of the entire operation, a meeting that produced agreements that turned out to be less reliable than the negotiations had suggested. The central figure in the Allied political strategy was General Henri Giraud, a French general who had escaped from German captivity and who had agreed to come to North Africa and assume command of French forces there if the Allies could extract him from Vichy France. The expectation was that Giraud's prestige and his anti-German credentials would be sufficient to bring the French military in North Africa to the Allied side. The expectation was wrong. Giraud arrived in North Africa and discovered that the French officers who were actually in command did not recognize his authority and had no particular reason to follow his orders. The man who actually could deliver the French military in North Africa was Admiral Jean-François Darlan, the commander-in-chief of all Vichy French forces, who happened to be in Algiers on November 8 visiting his sick son. Darlan was a collaborator with Germany who was widely despised by the Free French movement and by large segments of the Allied public, but Darlan was the man who had the actual authority over the French forces that were fighting the Americans. Eisenhower made the decision to negotiate with Darlan despite his political history, because the military situation required it and because the alternative, continuing to fight French soldiers who could become allies, was producing casualties that the operation could not sustain. The Darlan Deal, as it became known, produced a ceasefire in North Africa on November 11, 1942, 3 days after the landings, and brought the French forces in North Africa to the Allied side. The political controversy that followed was severe, both in Britain and in the United States, because the arrangement meant working with a man who had been an active collaborator with Nazi Germany. The controversy was resolved by events when Darlan was assassinated on December 24, 1942, by a young French monarchist, and was not required to be resolved by the Allied governments that had been uncomfortable with the Darlan Deal since the day it was announced. The military dimension of the North Africa landings was itself a story of the specific combination of success and difficulty that American forces produced in their first major combat operations of the war. The Western Task Force under General George Patton, landing at Casablanca, encountered the most significant French resistance of the 3 landing sites. The French fleet in Casablanca harbour sortied to engage the American naval force and was destroyed in an engagement that demonstrated both the quality of the American naval force and the specific determination of French naval officers who were following their orders. The French shore batteries at Casablanca engaged the American transports and had to be suppressed by naval gunfire before the landing could proceed. The fighting continued for 3 days before Darlan's ceasefire order reached the Casablanca garrison and was obeyed. The paratroopers who were supposed to seize the airfield at Tafaraoui near Oran, part of the Centre Task Force under General Lloyd Fredendall, conducted one of the most confused operations of the entire war, their aircraft scattered by wind and navigational errors, many landing far from their objectives in a pattern that recalled and predicted the airborne confusion of Sicily, and that provided the first of the lessons that would eventually produce the more successful airborne operations of. Later in the war, the Eastern Task Force landing at Algiers achieved its objectives most quickly, partly because the preparations had been most effective there and partly because the French resistance was least organized. By November 11th, 3 days after the landings, all 3 landing sites were secured and the French ceasefire had converted potential adversaries into allies. The military campaign that followed would push east across Algeria and into Tunisia, where it would meet the British 8th Army advancing from the east and trap the German and Italian forces between them. The North Africa campaign that followed Operation Torch lasted until May 1943 and included the Battle of Kasserine Pass and the subsequent recovery and transformation of American forces that was covered earlier in this channel. But the story of Operation Torch itself, the first American amphibious operation of the Second World War, the political drama of the French resistance and the Darlan Deal and the specific confusion of the paratroopers scattered across Algeria, is the story of a military that was learning in real time what modern war required and was paying in lives for the lessons it had not yet learned. The American soldiers who came ashore at Casablanca and Oran and Algiers on November 8, 1942 were among the first Americans to fight in the European theatre since the doughboys of the First World War had come home in 1919. They had been trained for war but had not fought in one, and what they found when they landed in North Africa was that the gap between training and war was real and substantial and required the specific education that combat provides. They got that education. They paid for it in the casualties that Kasserine Pass produced. And the army that emerged from the North Africa campaign, tested and changed by the experience, was the army that went on to Sicily and Italy and Normandy. It started on a beach in northwest Africa on November 8, 1942, when the first American soldiers of the Second World War's European theatre waded ashore into an operation that was simultaneously a military campaign and a political crisis. They waded ashore anyway. That was always going to be enough.